in the Bible, Esau is portrayed as this hairy guy, like super hairy, outdoorsman, hunter kind of guy, leads with his gut. He's off, he'll come in from a hunt saying, "Feed me, I'm so hungry." Well, his brother, Jacob, on the other hand, maybe his twin, but not his identical twin. He was very smooth, it says in the text. We learn a lot about his body, not a lot of body hair. He was very sensitive in his temperament, it said. And he didn't go out and hunt like his brother. Instead, he dwelt amongst the tents with the women. And in fact, while his brother Esau was out hunting, Jacob was a fabulous cook. And it's interesting, you actually don't see a lot of cooking by men in the Bible. I mean, you have Jacob doing it, and then you have men offering burnt offerings unto the Lord, kind of like a holy barbecue to God. But in the Hebrew Bible, there's almost no male preparing food like this. Now, in the Christian Bible, you do have Jesus doing some food preparation. Like there's like large-scale catering that he does, like multitudes. And then there's that like fish fry towards the end, post-resurrection. But actually preparing a meal, that is something exclusively for females. So you have Esau, you have Jacob. They're these two brothers, gendered differently. Now, Jacob clearly is heterosexual in the way he partners with people and has multiple sexual partners and lots of children. But he's gendered differently. And he has a very special son, a famous son, Joseph. Joseph is very different from his brothers. There's some interesting gender differences I've noticed about Joseph. In fact, there's one thing I noticed in the Hebrew that I didn't see in English. And so I want to share with you the story of Joseph and reveal this mystery about him in the text. I'll weave it into the performance. And to change the perspective a little bit, I want a different person to tell the story. I want to see the story of Joseph from the perspective of his uncle Esau, the big, burly, masculine guy. Let's see what he has to say about him.
Yeah, I'm Esau. You probably know my brother Jacob, although he went and changed his name to Israel. We're twins, Jacob and me, although you never know it by looking at us. I mean, I'm a real man. I'm big, I'm hairy. I'm always out in the field doing real men's work, while my brother, Jacob, he's as smooth as a woman. He was very sensitive growing up. He liked to dwell amongst the tents with the women. They're cooking, they're gossiping, they're scheming. He was a real girly boy. And since I was normal, well, our father, Isaac, well, he favored me. Now, don't get me wrong. Although my brother was a girly boy, he liked the women, okay? In fact, he had 2 wives and slept with both their handmaidens. And from those women, he had a pack of children, daughters, sons, strong, strapping young men, all of them. Yeah, except for one of his youngest, Joseph. This kid. He was trouble from the day he was born, always crying, clinging to his mother, and then he didn't want to go out to do real men's work. And then he started having these dreams, these crazy dreams he told everyone about. Listen, boys are not supposed to dream. So one day I pulled my brother aside. I said, listen, you got to do something to this kid. Toughen him up. It's a rough world. They're just going to ride right over him. But does he listen to me? No. He gives him everything he wants, including that robe. Oh, listen. I would want nothing to do with a robe like that. For one, too expensive for my taste. A royal garment, the kind of garment that a king would give to his virgin daughter. It was a princess dress. Yeah, my brother Jacob, he gave his son Joseph a princess dress, and that kid, he put that dress on. He flitted about the compound like he was some kind of butterfly. And I thought, this is not gonna end well. Sure enough, one day when the boys were out in the field doing real men's work, Jacob sent Joseph to go check on them, and that kid No sense in his head. He puts on the stupid dress, goes traipsing across the countryside, making fools out of all of us. Well, his brothers, they saw him in a distance. Who could miss him in that getup? And they said, enough of this dreamer. And they rushed him. They threw him to the ground. They beat him black and blue, trying to beat some sense into him. Then they ripped off the stupid dress, tore it to pieces, defiled it in blood, and came back with a bloody garment and a story about how their brother was attacked by a wild beast, and that's all that remained. But later they pulled me aside. They told me what really happened, how they sold their brother to some trader going off to Egypt, sold him as a slave. And I thought, well, maybe it's all for the best. I mean, I'm a shepherd. You know, when you got a weak lamb, you got to take it out. It's just going to bring the rest of them down. And besides, the kid might do okay for himself there in Egypt land, where they go in for the whole girly boy thing. Well, through the years, I didn't give him a second thought. I mean, who's got time to mourn? Then we had that drought, famine. You know, it comes in cycles. You just got to be man enough to ride it out, but this time was different. It was like the earth was cursed against us year after year. It got so bad we finally sent the boys to Egypt to get some grain. Not to beg. We don't beg from no one. But they were brought before some high official in Pharaoh's court, and at first they couldn't tell what it was, a man or a woman with the headdress and the makeup, the flowing robes. Those Egyptians. Turns out it was their very own brother, Joseph. Somehow that girly boy worked his way up through the ranks to become second in command of the whole kingdom, but they didn't recognize him under all that gunk. Now this was Joseph's chance to get back at his brothers, to get his revenge. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You don't let anyone ride over you. But does he? No. Not that girly boy. He goes off weeping like a woman, and then he comes back to try to teach his brothers a lesson. And then he forgives them, and he reconciles with them. He gives them food, he gives them shelter. He treats them like he's their sister or their mother, not like any man that I've ever seen. And in so doing, that girly boy, my nephew, Joseph, he saved us all.
Now, I don't know about you, but I always cry when I hear the Joseph story. I mean, it's a very moving narrative, and the way it's constructed, it's really very powerful. What we're looking at is the story of a blended family. There are multiple mothers and multiple children, and there's a lot of tension in the story about inheritance rights. Who's going to get all this stuff? And some of the older brothers fall out of favor, and then there's a shift that happens because young Joseph comes along, and the brothers begin to get worried because he's the favored son. And Joseph's a bit of a brat at times. I mean, he's very precocious, so he lords it over his brothers. He's very verbal, linguistic, and he's always telling these stories in dreams. And then, to make matters worse, Jacob gives Joseph this garment. Now, in English translations, it's sometimes translated as a coat of many colors, or a robe with long sleeves. But if you look at a study Bible, there's often a note at the bottom, and it says the exact meaning of the Hebrew word is unclear. That scholars are not exactly sure what this garment was that Jacob gave to Joseph. So, if you're going to do some Bible scholarship, you have to ask, well, what is the word in Hebrew, and where else does it appear in the text? Because that can give us some light about what it might mean. The word is actually a very short phrase. It's ketonet pasim. Jacob gave Joseph a ketonet pasim. And if you look in the book of Genesis, that phrase appears nowhere else at all. It's just the story of Joseph, that he gets the garment from his father, that his brothers ultimately rip off of him and tear to pieces. So you say, okay, well, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, has lots of books to it. Surely ketonet pasim appears somewhere else in it. And if you look through the entire Old Testament, this phrase does not appear anywhere else except in 2 Samuel, a story about King David. It's actually a story about King David's daughter, Tamar. And it's a terrible story of sexual violence and of rape and what happens in a family and a nation when people don't take that crime seriously. In this story, David's got multiple wives and sexual partners, and lots of half-brothers and sisters are formed. And at one point in the story, Tamar is tricked by her half-brother, lured into his rooms, and she is raped. And in a sign of mourning, she rents her garment. She tears her clothing. And in the text, it says that the princess Tamar is wearing a ketonet pasim. But then it goes on to define it for us. The garment worn by the virgin daughters of the king. A princess dress. Now I can just imagine some traditional male scholar looking at the Genesis account, looking at the 2 Samuel account, and concluding, the exact meaning of the Hebrew word is unclear. Maybe you have no idea what it could mean. It could be anything. Actually, no. If you have any intellectual integrity, you have to admit that one possible interpretation is that Jacob gave his son this female garment. It doesn't have to be the only interpretation. It doesn't even have to be the one that you agree with, but it needs to be on the table because it's in the text. And if we follow through on this interpretation for a moment, suddenly the story takes on a whole new light. When the brothers, who already have issues with Joseph, see him in public wearing the ketonet pasim, they get irrationally violent, and they do violence against him and the garment. And yeah, they used it as a clever ruse to trick their father, but if it was such a fine garment that they were jealous about, they would have figured out a way to ditch their brother, and somebody would have gone home wearing the ketonet pasim. But no. There was something they didn't like about it. There was something transgressive. And there's something about their violence that seems punitive, like, we're going to teach you a lesson. And the violence I hear about in that story reminds me very much about violence I hear about today towards gender non-conforming people, particularly transgender people, especially transgender women of color. Horrific violence against people who are seen as different. Joseph experiences this level of violence from his own brothers. He's shipped off to Egypt, and there in Egypt, he is favored by everyone. He is a beautiful man, it says in the text, a descriptor that doesn't happen often with men. But even so, he does get into trouble at one point in the story, and he goes to jail. But even in the all-male prison population, he rises to the top. And then this moment comes when his brothers appear before him. He's second in command of the kingdom at this point, and they don't recognize him. They've come as climate migrants looking for food in a drought. And there they are, assembled before him. He's in full Egyptian drag. Now, he has the right to crush them. If he was like any other man in the family, that's what he was taught, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But he doesn't. He acts in an extremely different way than most men would in his family. He tries to teach them a lesson. He forgives them. He reconciles with them. He becomes like the matriarch of the family, bringing them all together. Not that a man can't do this sort of thing, but back then in that family, you didn't see that modeled. So what Joseph does, he expands the way that a man can respond to conflict. And as a result, I see him as an extremely important gender non-conforming character.